He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul.
Good morning. For the next couple of weeks through July, we are going to be looking at a series of unlikely disciples. And, one of the first things I'd probably want to say about that is, what is it that makes an unlikely disciple? It's not, I was trying to think the best ways to put this. It's not sin. Sin is not what makes you an unlikely disciple. In fact, sin is the thing that should make you the most likely disciple. So why is it that we would use a term like unlikely disciple? And I really struggled with what to call this series of sermons, because deep down inside, I don't really like the term unlikely disciple, but I couldn't think of anything better. You know, when we think in terms of the Bible and we look at the ministry of Jesus and we say, well, this person was probably kind of an unlikely disciple, the reason that we say that is it only looks like it's unlikely from somebody who's looking at it from a religious point of view. You know, for this example, this morning we're looking in Luke chapter 7, and it is where Jesus encounters a sinful woman. And the Pharisee even looks at the sinful woman and he says, well, if Jesus knew what kind of person this was, because he was thinking that's the very least type of person who would find faith in Jesus, but, the person that looks like they're least likely to find faith in Jesus is often the one that is most likely to find faith in Jesus, and it's only self-righteous if you're it's only unlikely if you're looking at it through the eyes of someone who is like a self-righteous religious leader. So we have to be really careful not to make that mistake. We have to be really careful about looking at the world that we live in and us trying to decide who looks like a likely disciple or an unlikely disciple. We never, ever make that kind of judgment on anybody. We make no kind of presumptions on discipleship. So what happens in Luke chapter 7? In Luke chapter 7, there is this verse at the end that kind of summarizes the whole encounter for Jesus. For she loved much, but he who has been forgiven little loves little. And that was a stinging rebuke at a man who was a Pharisee, and he was considered to be religious, when Jesus is looking at these two people that he encounters. So here's what happens in Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. And I don't know why my computer keeps doing weird stuff here, but I can fix that and just get rid of it. So here's what happens. Jesus has been out teaching, and he comes to, he's in the city, and a Pharisee comes to him, and he invites Jesus to come to his house to have dinner. So Jesus goes to the Pharisee's house to have dinner, and while he is there, this woman that the text simply says she's just a sinful woman comes into the Pharisee's house where Jesus is. Now, you might think at the beginning that seems a little kind of weird, that somebody would come into your house when they probably really weren't invited into the house. So we'll talk about that a little bit. First, there's this contrast. So you have a Pharisee. Now, nobody really knows how many Pharisees there were in the New Testament. Most estimates it's that there were about 6,000 of them. It probably comes from, the word Pharisee probably comes from a Hebrew root word that means kind of to separate yourself. They're a group of people who are extremely, they were extremely serious about Old Testament law. I mean, they wanted to follow God stringently. They had this great desire to be men of God. Excuse me. Now, and they're really serious about godly things. The problem was they began to emphasize law more than they began to emphasize grace and mercy, which is what Jesus addresses. But at the core, they really wanted to be godly people. We would consider them looking, if we were in their world and we were looking at them, we would say, hey, they're kind of the religious folks. They're kind of the upper level type of religious folks. Those guys are really, really serious about following God. And then there's the sinful woman. And it's really interesting to me that the text just says, and she was a sinner. Now, when we read that, and she was a sinner, we immediately start trying to figure out what kind of sinner was she, right? We want to know. And it's interesting to me, Jesus never defines her sin. He never says what kind of sinner she was, just that she was a sinner, and evidently people in town kind of knew that she was a sinner. Now, you know, from reading the text and doing Bible studies, most people think she was a prostitute. And that may be a good guess. Maybe she was a prostitute. But it's still interesting that Jesus never defines it. And Luke, when he writes Luke 7, Luke never defines it. There was a word for prostitute. Luke could have written, instead of she was a sinner, Luke could have written she was a prostitute. He could have written she was an adulteress. He could have written she was a swindler, or she was greedy, or she was a murderer. I mean, he could have put in any kind of word there that he wanted, but he didn't. He said she was a sinner. Now, I think Luke did that on purpose. I think Luke did that on purpose. I think he left the description so vague so that each one of us could identify with a woman who is called a sinner. You know, there are two kinds of sinners in the world: those who need to be forgiven and those who have been forgiven. But we all fall under that category. I look at the sinful woman, and we're kind of putting the unlikely sinners in categories. So the category that I put this unlikely sinner in is kind of a category that somebody who is involved in intentional sin. Now, I don't want to be unfair to this woman that's in the text, because there were several reasons. If she were a prostitute, there are several reasons you could become a prostitute in that world. One is that you just decided to be a prostitute because you wanted financial gain or you wanted personal favor. And maybe that's where she fit in. Sometimes women who are no longer under the protection of a father or a husband or a family member had no other way to survive in that world, to provide for themselves besides prostitution. Maybe she was that. Maybe she was sold into prostitution. Or maybe she was a slave. Maybe she was a temple prostitute of one of those pagan shrines where part of your worship to the pagan god was sexual encounter with a female prostitute or a male prostitute, which was done in a way to provide worship to the god that you were worshiping, as far as that is from our mind. Maybe she was one of those. Whatever she was, and whatever reason she was in that particular situation, this is one thing that we do know: she was a sinner. However she got there, and however she progressed to that point, she was a sinner. So here is this woman who's known, evidently, because the Pharisee knows who she is. If he knew what kind of woman this was, her reputation preceded her in some ways. How did she get in the Pharisee's house? And why was she there? You know, that was probably the very last place that she wanted to be. She took a chance, despite the opinions of others or despite what anybody else thought about her. There was a custom in that day. Houses were generally open. And if there was a teacher or a rabbi or somebody that was important that was coming to a particular house, and you wanted to see that person, even though that person might be having dinner with the host who invited them, if there were room, you would be allowed to go in and maybe stand around the edges of the wall or stand at the door, or something to listen to what the teacher had to say or the important person had to say. So there were probably other people besides this sinful woman who had gone into the Pharisee's house that night to kind of see what was going on. The point is, if you read Luke 7 and you understand how the Pharisee felt about the sinful woman, do you think, and y'all can answer this if you want, do you think he was really excited to see her in his house? Not likely. He was probably thinking the whole time, I wonder how am I ever going to get this house clean again? You know, how am I going to get all of that sin out? What in the world is this woman doing in my house? He might have even thought, I wonder what other people think about this woman being in my house. I wonder if they think she's been here before. You know, and he's thinking about all of these things that are going on, probably. You know, I doubt that she looked at that house, that Pharisee's house, and thought, man, that's the first place I want to go. I want to go to the Pharisee's house. Y'all ever heard people say, well, if I ever went to the building, the church would probably fall in, right? Y'all know people that say that? That's probably how she felt about the Pharisee's house. Well, if I go in there. Why was she there? Just think about this for a second. Why was she there? Because that's where Jesus was. That's where Jesus was. And you think, well, why didn't she pick some other time? Why didn't she pick while he was walking down the street? I don't have any idea. The text doesn't tell me. I think it's because she had this just deep desire to be where Jesus was, that she was going to be there at that moment because she knew that she needed Jesus. Now, after today, we have a servant Sunday meal downstairs. If y'all are going to stay having hamburgers and hot dogs, that's just a preview, right? And you're going to go down there and you're going to sit at a table, most likely, and eat something. And so when Jesus went in to recline at the table, what did it look like? Well, it didn't look like us sitting downstairs eating around round tables. There is usually a rectangular type table that sat in the room. You didn't have chairs. And so when you recline at the table, this is what reclining at the table would have looked like. Now, Jesus would have been sitting at that table somewhere, probably since he wasn't the person of honor, or maybe if he was, he would have been somewhere around that table. And he's kind of, I need you to envision this, he's kind of lying down with his feet stretched out behind him. Do you remember what happens? She comes in. She's behind Jesus at his feet. She's weeping. She's wetting his feet with her tears. Seeing that, and I think probably not knowing what to do, she starts to wipe them with her hair, and taking your hair down in public was not something that was smiled on. She's got this alabaster jar of anointment where she starts to anoint Jesus, and we will talk about that in just a second. But here's the point. She came seeking Jesus. She wasn't there to see the Pharisee. She wasn't there necessarily to hear all of Jesus' incredible teaching, although he was an incredible teacher. She came to show honor to Jesus. She came looking for him. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, and this is my confession, okay, so it's confession time. If you paid real close attention this morning, you will notice that the same songs we sang this morning, we sang 2 weeks ago when I was going to preach this sermon first, because I put the songs in the wrong spot in the planning software, and Travis put those songs in there for the Father's Day sermon, where, by the way, I had songs picked out that had every song mentioned Father, but I put that song series in another week, and he didn't know to use it. That was all my fault. But the reason I picked the songs that I picked this morning is because I went through the list and I thought, what kind of songs would the sinful woman have picked out? And I have found a friend in Jesus. I think she would have picked that one out. My only hope is you. I think she would have picked that one out. Why? She didn't have anywhere else to turn. Will you take a chance for Jesus without worrying about what other people have to think about it? Because deep down, we spend a lot of time thinking about what other people think about us. I've told you this story before. A friend of mine, haven't seen him in years, but I'll never forget him. Charles Lovejoy. Charles Lovejoy would tell me one thing. He'd tell me more than one thing, but the one thing that I remember who you work for. Hey, you know, that was good advice to a young youth minister. Remember who you work for. Now, I hope Diane is kind of happy that she married me. Been married 35 years now, as a couple of weeks ago. That was all kind of cool. You know, I hope the boys think that I'm a good father. I hope they kind of like me, you know, enough to tolerate me. You know, I hope my parents look at me and think, you know, he was a pretty good son. I hope they kind of like me. But deep down, and I'm not making light of any of those relationships because they're really important. You know, I joke about y'all sometimes. I joked about y'all at the barbershop last week, on Wednesday. I always get my hair cut on Wednesday. So went over Wednesday, got my hair cut, and they said, how things going at church? And I said, well, pretty well. And I said this, and I mean it. Sometimes people at church say, we really like you. And I think, man, I don't know if that's a compliment or not, because in the Old Testament, they didn't like any of the prophets. So, like, if you tell me you like me, maybe that means I'm not doing my job right. You know, I kind of struggle with that sometimes. At the end of the day, who does it matter that likes me? Y'all can answer this. It's okay. And I know this is church, right? Tell me, Ryan pointed. Who? Ryan? God. Jesus. And she took a chance. It didn't matter what anybody else thought about her being at that house. She was going to that house to bring honor to Jesus. She was pursuing Jesus. And I just ask you, will you pursue Jesus the way the sinful woman did? And not only that, she placed value on him. She brought this alabaster jar of perfume. It's small. You know, an alabaster jar, most of those about 4.5 inches tall. They're designed in such a way, you can see it on these. I don't know if this little pointer works. On these, the way the top is, when you break it, you know, it's not like you can put the stopper back in. It's not like Diet Coke or Coke where you can put the lid back on it and you can save some for later. When you use it, you pretty much use it. It's very expensive, and you save it for a very special occasion. Maybe you anoint someone when they pass away to show honor to them. Maybe you anoint someone who comes into your house with something because they have such great value to you. What that represent was great value. She placed great value on Jesus. Now, I know you know the story, and I didn't have to read it. Who did not anoint Jesus when he came into the house? The Pharisee. He didn't even do the general customs of the day. You come into a house, you provide somebody with some water to wash their feet so they can clean up a little bit. Did he do that? Oh, no. How did she do it? With her tears. And he wiped them dry with her hair. You didn't even give me a kiss. Now, y'all would think I was really weird if you came to my house and I met you at the door and gave you a kiss on the cheek, wouldn't you? Y'all would be like, I ain't ever going over there again, right? But that was customary in the day, right? Nancy Blanton's favorite verse was greet one another with a holy kiss. She'd quote that to me every time, greet one another with a holy kiss. I didn't give her a holy kiss, but she always quoted it to me. Right? And you look at that and you think, wow, that seems kind of like a strange custom, but it was the custom. Did Simon practice the custom? Oh, no. No, he didn't give him a kiss on the cheek. What did you say about the woman? Man, she hadn't stopped kissing my feet. Hadn't stopped kissing my feet. Humility. She placed honor on Jesus. She knew that Jesus was somebody important. She realized who Jesus was. She looked at Jesus and said, this is the Son of God. She was looking for redemption, and she knew that the only place she could find redemption was Jesus. It wasn't about the alabaster jar. It wasn't about how much money it cost. It was because it represented her heart. It represented her heart, and the heart is the most important thing we can give to Jesus. Because you think about all the things that your heart desires and all the things that your heart pursues. The most important thing we can give to Jesus is our heart. See, it wasn't about the perfume or the tears. They were just evidences of how much she trusted and she loved Jesus. And there was another thing about the sinful woman. She didn't allow her past to define her desire for redemption. You know what never happened in the story? Never in the story did Jesus look at her and say, well, listen, honey, you're not really a sinner. No, he didn't. He recognized her sin. He didn't excuse her sin. He didn't tell her it was really okay. He knew her sin. But he forgave her. Man, you hear this all the time. Well, starts like this. I'll never be good enough, ... No, you won't. You'll never be good enough. Well, if you knew what I had done, ... that means if you knew what I had done, you wouldn't be thinking that Jesus would forgive me. And I don't care what you have done, I would still be thinking Jesus can forgive you. I haven't seen anything yet that Jesus can't forgive. She didn't look and say, you know what? There's a lot of people in that house more righteous than me, so I don't think I'll go in there. Well, guess what? I think if you're honest, you can always find two kinds of people. You can always find somebody that you think is more righteous than you, and you can always find somebody that you think is worse than you. And we will do that in our head 1,000 times. You know, I'm bad, but I'm not as bad as so-and-so. Did you know what so-and-so did? Or we'll say, well, you know, I'm kind of good, but you know, there's so, now he's just like, he's just really, really, or she's just really, really good. And Jesus looks at that woman, and all he sees is a woman who needs forgiveness, who loves him, and is willing to come looking for forgiveness. Where you are is less important than where you're going. I don't know where you are right now. Some of you I do. But where you are going is more important than where you are, and where you have been is much less important than where you are going or what you're going to be. This is what I know about the Jesus that was in Simon's house, that the sinful woman came to see. Now, after listening to that story, which one would you call the most unlikely disciple, the sinful woman or the Pharisee? Honestly, probably the most unlikely disciple might have been the Pharisee. But Jesus still has the power to forgive sin. Do you realize he hasn't lost that? You know, at the end of that, you know, they're scratching their head and they're thinking, who is this that even has the power to forgive sin? Who is it? It is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, who is coming to give his life on the cross, who had the ability just with a word to say, your sins are forgiven. And if Jesus showed up in the flesh today, right in this building, just to say Jesus shows up in the flesh, descends right down from heaven, moves me off of the podium, stands right here, puts me in my seat, and Jesus looks out and he says, your sins are forgiven. You know what? Your sins are forgiven, because he has the power to say that. He has the power to make that happen, and he still has the power to make that happen. Remember what he said to Simon? For she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. Do you realize how much Jesus has done for you? Would you be the Pharisee who reclines at the table and wonders what Jesus is going to say and what great word he's going to pronounce? Or would you be a sinful woman who understands the greatness of forgiveness so much that you offer to Jesus everything that you have to offer without regard of what anybody else is going to say or to think about it. There's a reason he just said she was a sinner. Because when we read about the sinful woman in Luke 7, what we should see is ourselves. And if you realize how much you have been forgiven, then you love much. But do you love enough to give your whole heart, your life, your everything that you are to Jesus? You need to respond in some way.